Hey guys, Fox here, and today we're going to be talking about how the XFL has just announced the team names for all the teams in the 2023 XFL, the third rendition of the XFL, and we're going to be talking about basically what that means, what teams are, and all that kind of stuff. So, to put it simply, the league has just announced all their new teams, like names and stuff like that, and they did have the logos. So, we're going to be looking through all these. Naturally, this is from an ESPN article, XFL 2023, team logos, names, coaches, stadiums, and more. So, to put it simply, it's by the ESPN staff. Starts off with just talking about how it's back for its third iteration, as it had tried twice and had failed once purely by failing, and then failed by proxy because of COVID. And then we are now here at we now have those, as the XFL released the franchise names and brands Monday. The next step, the league readies for kickoff in February, which will be shown on ESPN Family Networks, assigning 16 quarterbacks to franchises, 2 per team, and stuff like that. So, the first thing I want to mention before we actually get into the team names is that the fact that they are assigning quarterbacks to franchises, I already think is a pretty big detriment to the league. I think one of the things that the USFL actually received a good amount of hype for and publicity for was the draft actually allowing you to draft by position. So the quarterbacks, it was who was going to get taken to where, who was going to get the good ones, stuff like that. I think just straight up assigning quarterbacks isn't really the best play overall. So I think it was a pretty big miss on their part doing that. But yeah. So the first team is the Arlington Renegades. So essentially they're bringing back the Renegades name, but rather than calling them the Dallas Renegades like they were in 2020, they're now the Arlington Renegades. They're going to be playing at Choctaw Stadium, and their coach is Bob Stoops. Stoops is from University of Oklahoma. He coached there for about 17, 18 years, and he pretty much made him a very, very powerful program, made him great. And he's the winningest coach in Oklahoma history, and he coached the Dallas Renegades back in 2020. And so already, it's a very solid idea. Bringing back the names of teams you had before. Granted, it's a different city name, but it is a very solid idea bringing back the same coach and all that kind of stuff. As to put it simply, having publicity and name brand recognition is a thing that USFL had an advantage of, as teams like the Houston Gamblers, LA Express, granted that team didn't come back, but the Philadelphia Stars and New Jersey Generals had name brand recognition from the original USFL. And so bringing back the Renegades names and the coach is a very solid idea. And the very next team, the DC Defenders, they brought back the DC Defenders name, just like they had in 2020. And they were a playoff team at the time of the league folding. They're playing at Audi Field, and their coach is Reggie Barlow. He played 8 seasons in the NFL with a few teams as a receiver and kick returner, and then he coached 13 years in HBCUs, and now he's the XFL. So, definitely one of the lesser known guys, but still a very decent, overall solid coach. He coached a few years in Division II Virginia State. He coached for some time at Alabama State. He does have an 83-58 record over his course of coaching and a conference title, though naturally compared to some of the guys that the USFL hired who had better conference titles, it's not the most insane. But now we get to one of the real solid teams to bring back and name stuff like that in the Houston Roughnecks. They're playing at TD-ECU Stadium. The coach is Wade Phillips. Everyone pretty much has heard of Wade Phillips. He's been one of the best defensive coordinators and best defensive assistant coaches in basically arguably football history, because he's been just that if you have Wade Phillips, you know you have a solid defense. He was a defensive assistant coach for 10 franchises, most recently the Rams during that first Super Bowl with McVay where they lost, but he helped guide him there. He's also been an NFL head coach over the course of 9 years, where he coached for the Broncos, Bills, and Cowboys. The only thing with him is that as a head coach, I feel that Wade Phillips is sort of like Todd Bowles this year. He's one of those guys that is better served as a defensive coordinator than a head coach, especially if you remember how he handled the Bills. He basically single-handedly ended their playoff chances one year because he decided to not stick with Flutie for some reason. But overall, bringing back the Houston Roughnecks is a very solid thing. They were the best team in the XFL when they folded, and they are one of the 2 more recognizable teams. Granted, none of these teams are that recognizable, but they are decent. Next, you have the Orlando Guardians. They're going to be at Camping World Stadium. Terrell Buckley is their head coach. He spent 14 years as a cornerback in the NFL. He was a Super Bowl champion with the Patriots, and he worked as a college coach for 15 years after retiring as a player. He was an assistant coach in the college level from 2007 to 2021, and he was most recently the cornerback coach at Ole Miss for a couple of years. So he did have 50 interceptions in his NFL career, very solid player. I think this is a pretty decent guy to have hired. As we talked about these guys a while back, but, it's always nice to bring it back. So the thing is that the Guardians were a team in the original XFL, but they were in New York. But now we have the Orlando Guardians. So I think it's decent. We'll see how they do and stuff like that. Solid name overall. Then we have the San Antonio Brahmas. They're going to be playing at the Alamo Dome. Man, I said that wrong. Then their coach is Hines Ward. Everyone has pretty much heard of him. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler, MVP in the Super Bowl. He had one of the most iconic catches in Super Bowl history. He had over 1,000 receptions, 12,000 yards, 80 touchdowns, and he has had a couple seasons as coaching experience. But overall, he's more of a name kind of thing. This is an overall totally new team. There was no Brahmas, and there was no San Antonio team. So this is pretty much just a brand new team. Then we have the Seattle Sea Dragons. Overall, they should have just gone back to the Dragons, but like they were before, but they're close enough to a team that had a lot of guys go to the games despite how bad they were. They're being at Lumen Field. Their head coach is Jim Haslett. He played 8 years in the NFL as a linebacker and has been coaching the New Orleans Saints for 6 seasons. He does have experience in spin-off football leagues, as ESPN likes to call them. He led the United Football League's Florida Tuskers to a 6-0 record in 2009. And he has 3 decades of coaching experience as a head coach, defensive coordinator, and linebackers coach. Definitely a very solid type of coach, and it's definitely a good idea to bring back the Dragons name. It should have just been the Dragons, but it's okay. And then we have the St. Louis BattleHawks. This was the only other team that was basically known by everyone because they had a lot of fans, and they did have Jordan Ta'amu, who did receive a decent amount of publicity. They're playing at the Dome at America's Center. Head coach is Anthony Beck. He was a first-round pick in 2000. He was in the league for 11 years as a tight end for a bunch of teams. He ended up not having the most crazy stats, but he had almost 200 receptions, 1,500 yards, and 20 touchdowns. And as a player, he served as a coach. He actually was the tight ends coach for the AAF's San Diego Fleet in 2019. Overall, not one of the best coaches you could have gotten. And the only thing is, I would have imagined that the St. Louis team would have had, like, one of their biggest coaches overall in terms of experience and making sure they're going to be good. As, you know, it is pretty much the team that most people at this point are expecting to succeed, especially since the BattleHawks got so much publicity thanks to Jordan Ta'amu in the USFL. But that's just my thoughts. And the last team is the Vegas Vipers. The Vipers are, I guess, moving from Tampa Bay to Vegas. They are coached by Rod Woodson. They don't have a stadium as of right now. That's probably going to be where the Raiders play. Woodson was inducted to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2009 after a 17-year career, and he had a 12 interception return for touchdowns, which is an NFL record, and third in NFL history's 71 picks. He won a Super Bowl with the Ravens, and he spent 3 seasons as an assistant coach with the Raiders from 15 to 17. Overall, a very big-name coach, which is a good thing, but in terms of coaching experience, kind of questionable. We won't know for sure. It's going to be pretty insane to see. It's just, you know, decent kind of thing overall. So, as for the teams themselves and all the names coming back, it's definitely a good thing. Or for them, it's a good thing they brought back as many names and teams as they could. Because the biggest thing the USFL had is, as I said, the name brand recognizability. But as for the XFL, naturally, like I said before, their biggest thing is that their name brand on their coaches, I do feel, is better than the USFL. But their actual coaches, I feel, are worse than the USFL's coaches. I think that and that's going to be that thing where we kind of see is if publicity can beat out, you know, the actual name brand stuff. I think that the assigning quarterbacks isn't the best idea. I think that's a pretty bad idea to just assign teams quarterbacks rather than having a draft sort of selection. But I guess we'll overall just see whenever that happens. Overall, this has been Zom Fox. If you enjoy this content, want to be notified as soon as I upload any videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, have a great night.